Rain lashed Laura's silk wedding gown, clinging like a shroud. "You came from heaven, didn't you?" a child's voice piped up. Laura, abandoned at the altar, knew the cruel irony. Her descent wasn't divine, but a plunge into ruin, orchestrated by the man she was supposed to marry. Stood still, and at top Thornhill Hill, the white chapel waited. Laura Monroe stood alone at its doors in a gown of silk and lace. Her hands, gloved and trembling, clutched the bouquet like it might shatter. She was 19, the daughter of Judge Gideon Monroe, feared, revered, and obeyed across 3 counties. Her wedding was supposed to be the grandest event Dustle had seen in a decade, and yet something was wrong. The clouds churned above. Townsfolk gathered in uneasy silence. Hats tilted, parasols shifted. No one spoke above a whisper. Let them whisper. A Leicester Crane, age 48, wealthy landowner and twice widowed, was late. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Margaret Monroe gripped her daughter's arm tighter. Her voice had been cold that morning. "You will do this for your family, Laura. We are hanging by a thread. A Monroe woman sacrifices. She does not run." Laura had nodded, but not from agreement. There was no room to run, not in Dustwell, not with a name like hers. She had never loved a Leicester. She barely knew him. Their engagement was struck over ink and debt. Her hand traded to erase the judge's gambling losses. Leicester wanted her land, her youth, and the prestige of marrying into the Monroes. In return, her father kept his estate, and her mother kept her place in society. The town waited, buzzing like hornets under breath. A rider appeared on the ridge, horse-lathered, coat soaked in sweat. He didn't wear a suit, just a deputy's star dulled with time. He swung down, handed a sealed letter to Reverend Doyle, then disappeared without a word. The Reverend unfolded the note. He hesitated. "I've been asked to read this aloud." Laura did not breathe. He cleared his throat, voice cracking with each word. "I cannot marry a woman who has already known another man. I do not take used things as my wife." Silence collapsed like thunder. Some gasped, others coughed into their gloves. A child whimpered. Somewhere a man laughed, nervous, sharp, cruel. Laura's legs refused to move. Her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. Rain began to fall, not a sprinkle, but sheets pouring furious. Holy. The white lace clung to her skin like a second betrayal. She turned to her mother, whose mascara streaked down porcelain cheeks. Margaret cried, but didn't reach for her. Her father did not cry. Judge Monroe stared at her with cold steel eyes. Then he turned and walked inside the chapel, leaving her to drown in the shame. Everyone knew the rumor. When Laura was a child, she had vanished for 2 days with a black servant. He had taken her during a storm, and when they found her, frightened, unharmed, speechless. Judge Monroe had the man hanged by sunrise. The court declared her a victim. The town pretended to forget, but Leicester had not. He had money, influence. He bought a fake letter, bribed a drunkard to swear he'd seen things no child should endure, and stirred old whispers until they roared like fire. He never intended to marry her, just destroy her. Now no man would touch her, not in this town, not with that stain on her name. She dropped the bouquet. No one came after her. No one stopped her but her. She stepped down the hill in silence. Mud sucked at her shoes until she kicked them off. Her bare feet hit the earth hard and cold. Behind the chapel lay the graveyard, rows of crooked stones and rusted gates. She passed them without looking, the rain slicking her hair to her cheeks. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply vanished into the pines, a white ghost swallowed by the forest. A virgin in a ruined gown carrying nothing but her name and the lie that broke it. The rain did not let up. By the time Laura reached the creek, her gown had torn in 3 places, and her feet were numb from stone and thorn. The sky above the pines was a heavy gray bruise, pressing low against the mountains. The stream wound through the forest like a silver thread, swollen from the storm, frothing over smooth rocks. Laura fell to her knees at the water's edge. She was shaking, not from cold, from everything. Her body, her soul, her name. Nothing felt like hers anymore. The white dress hung on her frame like a cruel joke, soaked through and speckled with mud. She cupped water in her hands and drank. It tasted of earth and pine needles. Her fingers trembled. Then, without warning, a small voice broke through the trees. "Are you an angel?" Laura turned her head. A little girl stood just a few feet away, barefoot, with wild curls of pale gold and freckles scattered across her cheeks like cinnamon. Her blue eyes were round and impossibly bright. Her dress was too big, sleeves rolled up and hem dragging. The girl took a cautious step closer. "You came from heaven, didn't you?" she asked again, her voice full of something too innocent for a world like this. Laura blinked, stunned by the sudden presence of warmth. Then slowly she smiled, though her lips barely moved. "I know," she whispered. The girl tilted her head. "You look like you did." Laura wanted to laugh, but it caught in her throat like a sob. She studied the child, her barefoot stance, her curious eyes, the dirt smudges on her knees. She was perhaps 5 years old, maybe younger. "What's your name?" Laura asked softly. "Betty," the girl said. "My daddy says not to talk to strangers, but you don't look like a bad stranger. You look sad. Angels get sad sometimes, too." Laura closed her eyes. Rain slid down her lashes. "I'm Laura." Betty reached out her hand without hesitation. "You should come with me. You can't sleep outside. Daddy will be mad at first, but he's only mad when he's scared. And he's not scared of angels." Before Laura could reply, Betty had taken her fingers, muddy, small and warm, and began guiding her through the trees. Each step away from the creek felt like walking into some strange, in-between place. No longer the girl from Dustle, not yet. Whatever came next, they moved in silence. The forest sighing with water, the wind soft through pine needles. A hawk cried in the distance. Somewhere thunder rolled but never came closer. Soon the trees broke open into a clearing. A small log cabin stood in the center, smoke curling from the chimney, light flickering through the gaps in the shutters, a lean-to for firewood, a wheelbarrow half full of chopped logs, and 2 chickens clucking near a wooden pen. Betty opened the door without knocking. "Daddy," she called, "I found an angel." Footsteps heavy, hesitant, Lara's heart leapt. And then she saw him standing in the doorway, tall, broad, shouldered, with eyes the color of dusk and a rifle resting in one calloused hand. He looked at her like he had seen a ghost, and maybe he had. The man in the doorway said nothing. He did not lower his rifle. He did not blink. His jaw was tight beneath a week's worth of stubble, and the rain had made his shirt cling to the muscle of his chest. The dim light behind him caught the scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone, a memory carved in skin. Laura instinctively stepped back. Betty, unfazed, tugged her sleeve. "This is my angel, Daddy. She came from the sky." The man's eyes never left Laura. "Inside," he said, voice gravel and grit. Betty beamed and skipped in. Laura hesitated. He moved aside just barely, but enough. She stepped into the warmth. The cabin was small but lived in. A pot hung over the fire, rough wooden furniture, pelts draped over chairs, a single cot in the corner, hunting knives lined the wall, bullets on a shelf, a portrait of a woman and a baby covered in dust. She swayed, her knees buckled. Then everything went black. When she woke, the fire was glowing low, and the storm had settled into a steady hum. She was lying on a thick fur laid out by the hearth, her dress gone, replaced by a dry shirt that reached her knees. A blanket was pulled over her. Her cheeks burned, not from fever, but from the fact that someone had undressed her. Then she saw him. The man sat in a chair by the window, polishing a rifle, one eye still on her. "Where's Betty?" she asked, throat raw. "Sleeping?" She tried to sit up but winced. Her whole body ached. "I didn't ask to come here," she whispered. "No," he replied, "but you're here anyway." She looked at him fully now. The scar, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his belt where a knife hung sheathed. "You don't want me here," she said. He didn't answer. "What's your name?" He paused. "Mason." Something in his voice made her stomach twist. A name she'd never heard yet felt heavy with meaning. Mason Black. He looked at her, then really looked. And for a moment something changed in his face. Recognition maybe, or disbelief. "Your Judgment's daughter." It wasn't a question. Laura's breath caught. She didn't nod. She didn't deny it. Mason stood slow and deliberate. He poured water from a kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers. Warm, rough, real. "I should throw you out," he said. Laura swallowed. "Why don't you?" He looked away. "Because you're burning up, and Betty thinks you fell from the sky." She drank. The warmth spread through her like something holy. He knelt near the fire, took a bundle of herbs from a pouch, and began crushing them into a steaming bowl. "What is that?" "Fever tea." "You'll hate it." She did, but she drank it. Then he placed a cool cloth on her forehead, silently, gently, like it pained him to care. He sat beside her for a long time after that, never speaking, just staring into the fire like it owed him something. Laura turned her face toward the flames. "You hate me," she said. "I don't know you," he replied, "but you hate my name." He didn't deny it. She closed her eyes. And somewhere in the silence between thunder and breath, something began to thaw. Not trust, not yet, but something. Never. A storm passed overnight, leaving behind a forest slick with rain and silence. Morning mist curled through the trees, and the only sounds inside the cabin were the crackling fire and the soft breath of a sleeping child. Laura sat by the hearth wrapped in a blanket, her eyes on the wooden floor, but her thoughts tangled elsewhere. She could feel him behind her. Mason moving with quiet precision, skin weathered by years of exile, a man shaped by solitude and suspicion. Betty stirred in the loft above, then rolled over with a sleepy sigh. Laura's voice broke the stillness. "Why do you hate my father?" Mason didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Because he killed me." She turned to look at him, unsure if she'd misheard, but his eyes said he meant it. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. He nodded once. "I was," she waited. He sat across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "I served in the war," he began, his voice low. "Confederate scout. After Appomattox, I joined a resistance group. Riders who didn't want to lay down arms, men with blood in their teeth. Some of them crossed lines I wouldn't." Laura watched him unmoving. "Home night, the camp was raided. I got caught. Judge Monroe offered me a deal. Names for my life. I refused. Said I'd rather hang than sell out men I once rode with." She swallowed. "So he sentenced you to death by firing squad." Mason said no trial, no jury, just his word and a few soldiers eager to make an example. "But you're here." "I shouldn't be." He leaned back. "One bullet went through my shoulder. The others missed. They thought I was dead. Some Apache scouts found me barely breathing. They didn't know me a damn thing, but they patched me up, gave me a horse, and told me to disappear." Laura couldn't speak. Her hands gripped the blanket tighter. "He never told me," she said finally. "I never knew your name. I was a child." "I know," Mason said, "but you carry his name like a badge, and it brings ghosts." They sat in silence again, firelight flickering between them. "I always believed he was a good man," she said almost to herself. "Strict, harsh, but just." Mason looked at her long and steady. "You still believe that?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Upstairs," Betty yawned and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "You're still here?" she said to Laura, delighted. Laura smiled faintly. "Looks like I am. Did you sleep okay?" "I did, thanks to your daddy." Betty scrambled down the ladder and wrapped her arms around Laura's waist. "I told you he's nice when he's not grumpy." Mason turned away, busying himself with the kettle. Laura held the child, her mind spinning. Everything she had known about justice, about her family, about the man who raised her, was beginning to fracture. And Mason Black, the man she'd been taught to fear, was the only one keeping her warm. Distel was darker than she remembered, not just in the sky, though the moon was hidden and the clouds hung low. No, the darkness clung to the buildings, to the broken windows, to the narrow alleyways that twisted behind the saloon and post office. It was the kind of darkness that grew when people looked the other way for too long, the kind you couldn't light a lamp against. Laura moved through it like a ghost. Her cloak was soaked through, not with rain but sweat, cold from fear, warm from the horse ride that had rattled her bones over 2 miles of rocky trail. She'd taken the mare from an abandoned shack out near Widow's Bluff. The saddle was cracked, the reins frayed, but the horse ran hard and fast. It waited now, tied loosely behind the saloon, eyes wide and ears twitching. Laura's boots made no sound on the dirt path, but inside her chest, her heart beat like thunder, fast, fierce, and too loud for her own ears. She stayed in the shadows, moving past windows shuttered tight, past doorways that once welcomed her with respect. Now she was an intruder in her own hometown, a stranger walking among familiar ghosts. The courthouse loomed in the distance, gray and angular, bathed in a sickly wash of lamplight from the hanging lanterns. After sundown, it slept like the law it housed, cold and indifferent. She circled to the side door. It was locked as she expected. She pulled a small ring of keys from beneath her cloak. She had kept them hidden since she was 16, when she used to sneak into her father's office and pretend to sit the bench like he did. He never knew. Or maybe he had and let her dream. She tried the fourth key. It clicked inside. The air was thick with age. Ink, dust, paper. The oil lamps had all burned to crusted stumps. Her footsteps echoed down the marble hall, past the portraits of men who once called themselves honorable men with starched collars and painted eyes. She entered the records wing. Behind a false wall was the archive vault, her father's pride, and the place where everything worth bearing went to rest. Only 2 clerks and the judge ever had access. She lit a stub of candle and searched the tall cabinets, organized by type of crime, then alphabetically. Her fingers brushed the brass plates. Abby Mason. Her stomach dropped. She pulled open the drawer. The file was thinner than it should have been. 1 page, a single charge. Enemy of the Union, refused to comply. Sentence, execution by firing squad. No appeal, no transcript, no witness statements, no trial. Only her father's signature, her breath caught in her throat. She reached deeper and found something wedged in the back, a sealed envelope stamped with the Monroe family crest. The handwriting wasn't her father's. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a receipt, $2,000 in gold, paid by Alistair Crane to Judge Gideon Monroe. The second, a land transfer, the deed to the Black family ranch, signed over to Alistair 2 days after Mason's execution. Laura's hands began to shake. He hadn't just sentenced Mason to die. He had sold him, sold the land, sold the law. Her father had bartered a man's life for profit. Then came the sound that turned her blood to ice. Footsteps, voices, male, armed, dead to double-check the records room. Rumors about someone sneaking back in. Probably just rats. I don't get paid to guess. They were close, too close. Laura blew out the candle and melted into the wall. The door knob rattled. She grabbed the envelope, clutched it to her chest, and slipped into the adjoining supply room. From there, a narrow window led into the alley. She pushed it open, barely fitting through, and tumbled down into the mud. Stop. Hey. She didn't look back. She limped toward the saloon, untied the mare with trembling hands, and flung herself onto its back in one fluid, desperate motion. Then she rode. Dust well fell behind her, torches flickering, voices shouting, but none fast enough. She didn't slow down, not when the trail narrowed, not when her hands bled from the reins. She didn't stop until the first light of dawn stretched through the pines, and in her saddlebag, the truth throbbed like a living thing, hot, heavy, and finally free. By the time Laura returned to the cabin, dawn was breaking through the trees like gold spilling over stone. She looked half dead, mud on her hem, blood on her knuckles, hair clinging to her face. Mason stepped outside with his rifle at the ready, then froze when he saw her. "I need to talk to you," she said. Voice hoarse. He didn't ask questions, just stepped aside and let her in. Inside, Betty was still asleep, curled against a pillow she had named Mr. Feathers. Laura collapsed near the hearth, fumbling for the saddlebag. She pulled out the envelope and held it out. Her hands shook. Mason took it with a frown, brows furrowed. He opened it. Silence stretched long. When he read the land transfer, he inhaled sharply. When he saw the bribe receipt, his jaw clenched, and then he dropped the papers to the floor. "I didn't want to be right," he muttered. Laura sat motionless. knees drawn to her chest. "My father sold your life for land," she whispered. "He wasn't just cruel. He was bought." Mason turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I've hated that man for years," he said. "But I never thought a Leicester was behind it." She nodded. "He wanted your land and now mine." Mason stared at the hearth for a long while. Then he looked at her. Not with hate, not with blame, with something closer to weariness. "You didn't owe me this," he said. "I know. You could have kept running. I almost did." He walked to the window, then back again. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, tighter. "You risked your life for proof. I risked it for the truth." He leaned against the table, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Finally he said, "You ever fired a gun?" She blinked. "What? You're going to need to. They'll come for you, Laura. For both of us." She nodded almost too quickly, and so he showed her. They went into the woods behind the cabin, where the trees opened into a soft glade. Mason set up a row of empty cans on a log and handed her a revolver. Her fingers trembled. "Deep breath," he said. "Don't rush. Let the gun do the work." She missed the first 2 shots. By the third, she clipped the edge of a can. By the 6th, she knocked one clean off the log. She turned to him, beaming. "Not bad," he muttered, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. Next came the horse. It was old and ornery, but loyal. Mason saddled it and led her through the motions, mounting, reining, dismounting. By midday, she could trot a circle without sliding off sideways. They didn't talk about her father or the land or a Leicester. They talked about Betty, about the way birds flew in spirals before rain, about how silence in the woods meant a predator was near. In the afternoon, they sat near the stream, feet in the water. Mason leaned back on his elbows, hat over his eyes. Laura watched the sun filter through the branches. "You're not who I thought you'd be," she said. He didn't open his eyes. "Same. I used to think love was something quiet, neat, polite." He chuckled. "It's a knife in the ribs most days." She laughed, then fell quiet. He turned to look at her. "I'm not a good man, Laura." "I don't need a good man," she said. "I need a true one." He looked away as if the words struck too deep. A breeze passed between them. No kiss, no touch. Just 2 people sitting in the wild, bruised by life but still breathing, and something unspoken growing in the stillness. They came at dawn. The sky was still a dusky blue, caught somewhere between night and morning, when 6 riders appeared over the ridge. Long coats flapped behind them like black wings. Each man had a gun at his hip, and none of them rode with mercy in their eyes. A Leicester crane led the pack, his silver hair damp with dew, face tight with fury. On either side rode his hired guns, hardened, brutal men with sun-racked skin and dead stares. Behind them rumbled a wagon drawn by 2 exhausted mules. Slumped in the back sat Judge Gideon Monroe, wrapped in a wool blanket, eyes as sharp and cold as broken glass. His presence was not for show. It was personal. The riders halted just outside the tree-in, where Mason's cabin lay nestled in the pines, half hidden but not forgotten. Laura spotted them first. She stood at the loft window, her breath fogging the glass. "They're here," she said quietly. Mason didn't ask who. He already knew. He moved with purpose, lifting the rifle from the mantel, checking the chamber with practiced hands. He knelt beside Betty, who blinked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. He kissed her forehead and handed her a small cloth pouch. "Sugar candies," he said. "One at a time. You stay low. You don't come out until I call. Understand?" She nodded, lip quivering, but brave. Laura descended the ladder, pulling on her boots. Her hand wrapped around the pistol Mason had taught her to use. She checked the barrel. Loaded. She stood beside him. Outside, wind stirred the pine needles like the breath of something ancient and watching. Then came the voice. "Black!" a Leicester bellowed. "You've got 5 seconds to send the girl out and surrender yourself." Mason opened the cabin door. He stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually across his shoulder. His boots thudded on the wood. He raised his voice, calm as a winter lake. "You want her?" he called back. "Come take her." A shot cracked the silence. Mason's rifle spoke first loud and clean. One of the riders pitched backward off his horse, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. And then all hell broke loose. Gunfire exploded through the clearing. Smoke filled the air. Horses screamed and scattered. Mason vanished into the trees like he'd been born from shadow. Bullets tore through bark. Laura ducked behind a woodpile, heart hammering in her throat. A rider broke from the tree line, charging the cabin. Laura stepped out to meet him. She didn't hesitate. Her finger pulled the trigger before he could level his weapon. The shot struck him in the chest. He dropped, eyes wide in surprise, and crumpled at her feet. Inside, Betty whimpered, covering her ears. But she didn't scream. She stayed down just like Mason had taught her. Out by the wagon, Judge Monroe clutched his chest, his breathing shallow. Alistair shouted orders, but the men were falling or fleeing, loyalty dissolving in gunpowder and blood. Mason reappeared behind the last gunman, silent as death. One quick shot, and the clearing fell quiet. All that remained was Crane. Mason stepped forward, rifle trained on the man's heart. "Drop it," he said. Alistair turned slowly, gun in hand, but didn't raise it. He sneered. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You're still a traitor. She's still filth. And I—" A gunshot rang out. Judge Monroe jerked in the wagon, blood spreading across his chest like ink on paper. Alistair spun. "Gideon!" The old man struggled to breathe, voice a rasp. "I sold him out," he confessed, eyes wide and glassy. "I let you buy my justice." God help me," he slumped over, dead before he hit the wood. Alistair turned to run. He didn't get far. Mason tackled him hard to the ground, wrenching the pistol from his hand and pressing the barrel of his rifle to Crane's throat. "Do it!" Alistair snarled, eyes wild. "You want to be a killer? Finish the damn story." Mason looked down at him, looked to Laura, who stood nearby, her pistol still warm in her grip. Her eyes met his, and Mason shook his head. "No," he said. "You don't get to be a story. You get to rot." They dragged Alistair to the wagon and bound him in the same chains the judge had once ordered for Mason. By the time the sheriff of Dustle arrived, called by the smoke, the echo of gunfire, and a conscience too long buried, he found 4 dead men in the grass, a bleeding corpse in the wagon, and Alistair Crane bound like a common thief. He removed his hat and stood silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Mason and Laura, torn, tired, and standing tall. "Well," the sheriff said, voice quiet with awe, "looks like justice finally rode home." Spring came late that year. The last frost clung stubbornly to the shadows, and the mountains held on to their snow caps like old grudges. But when the thaw finally came, it came all at once, melting down the ridges, spilling into creeks, and soaking the hard-packed ground of dust well until it softened underfoot like new skin. The sun rose differently now, not with harsh heat, but with quiet warmth, like a promise, whispered rather than shouted. People in town walked slower, spoke softer. They talked about justice in uncertain tones, like it was a ghost they had seen, but weren't sure they believed. They talked about the judge's funeral, how Gideon Monroe went to the grave with secrets on his lips and shame in his legacy. And they talked about Alistair Crane in jail, awaiting trial, stripped of title, money, and the men who once called him friend. But mostly they talked about Mason Black, how the sheriff had issued an official pardon, how the old land deed was pulled from the courthouse archive and returned to its rightful owner, how the man they'd once called a traitor now walked through town with his head high and his rifle slung harmless across his back. A few men still muttered over whiskey glasses, but no one dared raise their voices. Not after what they'd seen, not after what had come to light. As for Laura Monroe, she made her choice without ceremony. She refused the estate. She wrote a letter to her family solicitor and sealed it in red wax. "Keep your money. Keep your name. I have found something better." Then she rode back to the forest, to the small cabin that had once been a place of hiding and now a home. They rebuilt it piece by piece. Mason replaced the broken beams. Laura mended the windows. Betty planted wildflowers at the porch steps and insisted they name the largest one Miss Dandelion. The air was clean again. One morning, Laura stood barefoot in the garden, her skirt tucked into her belt, her hands covered in fresh soil. The clouds had parted after a long, stubborn rain. Golden light broke through the trees and shafts that made everything shine. Beside her, Betty dug small holes with a wooden shovel, her freckles catching the sun. "Why do we plant them now?" she asked, poking at the dirt. Laura smiled. "Because the ground's soft and it's ready." Betty squinted up at the sky. "So the rain's really done for now," Laura said. Then came the question again, asked without irony, only wonder. "Are you still an angel?" Laura wiped her hands on her apron and thought for a moment. Then she crouched beside the child, looked her in the eyes and said gently, "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who got a second chance." Betty nodded like it was the only answer that ever made sense. Mason joined them, wiping grease from his fingers, his sleeves rolled up. He knelt beside Lara, took a single seed, and pressed it into the earth. They sat there, the three of them, palms in the soil, heads tilted toward the sky. No bullets, no lies, just breath. Just beginning. And as the wind stirred the tall grass beyond the field, it carried with it the scent of something rare. Not fear, not blood pace. If there had been a camera, it would have pulled back then, rising over the clearing, over the pines, over the mountains that had held their breath too long. Rain still clung to the leaves, but it had stopped falling. Thank you for riding with us through this unforgettable journey in Wild West love stories, where a betrayed bride, a hunted man, and an innocent child carved out a new beginning in the ashes of old lies. If Laura Mason and Little Betty's story moved you, if it made your heart ache, your soul stir, or your hope rise, then don't ride off just yet. Hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable tales of forbidden love, untamed hearts, and second chances born from dust and danger. Wild West Love Stories, where bullets missed but hearts didn't. Subscribe now and saddle up for more cinematic romance from the edge of the American frontier.